Good morning, everyone, or to our audience in Europe and elsewhere, good evening. I'm Chris Eldred, Public Relations Manager at the Berson Institute, and I'm really happy that you've joined us for the second in our series of events on the human scaffold, how not to design your way out of a climate crisis by alumni Berggruen fellow Josh Berson. This book, The Human Scaffold, was published by the Berggruen Institute and the University of California Press as the second installment in our joint series on the great transformations of the 21st century. And we're especially excited to have supported the research and writing and publication of this book in the Great Transformation series, because its core ideas about our civilization's preoccupation with physical stuff and the limits this places on our responses to the 21st century's major challenges really has tremendous bearing on all the elements of the Berggruen Institute's work, from the future of capitalism and democracy to the relationship between humans and the planet we live on. Today, we're thrilled to have Josh joined by Elizabeth Chin, editor-in-chief of the American Anthropologist and a professor at Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, California. They'll be drawing from one of the book's most intriguing case studies about divers in Korea and Japan who hold their breaths over long periods of time to gather food, to discuss the very overlooked politics of breathing as manifest from this kind of subsistence diving all the way to today's respiratory pandemic. They'll explore the idea of breathing as a skilled activity and the implications of this idea for culture, politics, and how humans imagine our possible futures. Josh is an anthropologist whose work explores the ecology of sentient behavior over time periods ranging all the way from momentary to the geological. He has held appointments at the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences and the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, among other places. And in addition to The Human Scaffold, he is the author of 2015's Computable Bodies and 2019's The Meat Question. So without any more buildup from me, I'd like to hand it over to Josh to say a little more about Elizabeth and to open up the discussion. Josh.
Thank you, Chris. So I first met Elizabeth Chin in 2015, and in fact, it was at the same conference where I met our discussant from last time, Simon Penny. And so this was a little conference that Jeff Bowker had organized in Irvine. And Elizabeth, you were invited, I imagine, to give a talk, but instead you didn't so much give a talk as a performance, right? One in a series that you referred to as the Laboratory of Speculative Ethnology. And this was the most amazing talk I had ever seen, or the most amazing thing, the most amazing intervention I had ever seen at any conference. And I imagine that it will continue to have been the most amazing intervention I've ever seen at any conference for a long time to come. And so we got to talking afterward, and at the time I was trying to learn a bit about sewing, and we talked about that because a lot of your research practice turns on fibercraft, and we just kept talking, and it's always a pleasure, and I'm just thrilled to have you here. So That's that's the best I can do. Start.
Well, thank you so much. And one of the things about you and your work and this book, and one of the things that I think connects us is a refusal to stay in the box, or not even a refusal, like a sort of fundamental inability.
I'd say that's the way I put it. Yeah.
And in reading the book and thinking with it, it's just so wide ranging and bringing so many different threads of thinking from so many different fields together in a way that's really extraordinary and I think really difficult to do. But it also, I work at a design school, and the title of the book is, how not to design yourself out of this dilemma that we're in. It's not the exact title of the book, but thinking a lot about the implications for design and designers, and particularly with this question that you raise through breathing, right, about entrainment and the body and the role of the body in human evolution and the course that it has taken and could take, but also the ways that we think I don't know who we are in this moment. Those aren't questions exactly, but I was wondering if you could start by talking about you say that evolution is a brittle concept.
Yeah.
And you use this example of breathing to explain why you say that.
Thank you. You've given me a lot to work with. Let me see if I can parcel it out.
You could start anywhere you want.
Yeah, what you say about fundamental inability to stay in the box, that shared inability, that is a big part of what makes it such a pleasure to share this chat with you. But in the case of this book in particular, I got about 2 chapters in. I got just to the end of the passage that you're referring to, and I realized there might not be a way to sell this book. And so it was just at that moment that I learned that the Berggruen was putting together this series. So it was fortunate, but it came about, I won't say in a fit of absent-mindedness, but completely by accident. It came about, in fact, because I had to take a day off from writing. So I'd written the first say 30% of the book, in a tearing hurry, and trying to get it blocked out, early on before too many collegial responsibilities obtruded themselves into my new life in Los Angeles. So this was not quite 3 years ago, and then I got to a point where I just sort of reached the square on discussion of the passage that in one sense had inspired this book. So this book has a long and twisted trajectory. I can actually picture where I was when I first knew that I would have to write a book, more or less on this theme, though I had no idea what form that would take. And it was October 2011. So already now, this is when I'm writing it, it's 7 years from the time when I first had the idea. And I was standing in a library at a research institute way on the opposite side of Berlin from where I am now. And I read this paper from 2004, and I thought, this is so wrong, and someday I'm going to have to explain why. And the paper was by at the time not widely known evolutionary anthropologist named Joseph Henrich. Right? This was before he published The Secret of Our Success and the Weirdest People in the World, and became sort of a pop anthro phenomenon. But in this paper, he outlines a model of the historical dynamics of cultural evolution. And he uses a case study from Tasmania to illustrate his ideas. And his ideas, he wasn't the only one expounding these ideas, but his paper is pretty much is really the index paper. It's the starting point for a long debate that unfolded over the 10 years that followed. And his argument, in a nutshell, is that in Tasmania, after the end of the Pleistocene and the warming phase of the early Holocene, so starting about 11,700 years ago, right? When the seas rise and the Bass Sill floods, cutting Tasmania off from the rest of Australia, you see the gradual loss of useful technology from the Tasmanian toolkit. Things like fitted clothing, things like fish hooks, right? Things you would expect people in a marine climate to have. And that this demonstrates that we live on a demographic treadmill, right? So in this metaphor, the speed of the treadmill is the rate at which errors accumulate as you try to conserve culture from one generation to the next. So anytime that you have a population of new learners, such as children, trying to acquire the technical skill they need to survive in their environment, they're going to get things wrong by observing skilled models. So there's always a rate of error. And if too many errors accumulate, you're going to lose things. So you need a sufficient population of skilled models to ensure that technical culture can abide from one generation and to the next. It's a crude sounding model, but it has certain merits, and it had attracted a lot of attention at that time. And Tasmania seemed to be in a particularly good place to exemplify it, because you have kind of a natural experiment, a situation where a population did lose its access to at least in theory, to a broader pool of experts, of skilled models, and then underwent what on the surface, if you look just at the archaeological evidence, looks like a contraction in useful technology over the subsequent generations. So but the example he homes in on, what really made me feel like there was something not being said here, is the contrast between a subsistence technique that was common in Tasmania at the time that Europeans first started visiting, and a technique that was common in another insular and peri-insular marine climate foraging community around the same time, which is the communities in Tierra del Fuego at the southern tip of South America. So he contrasts what the Fuegans did to what the Tasmanians did. So here's the passage. Among Fuegans, crafting bone-tipped arrows involved a 14-step process, 7 different tools, 4 of which were specially crafted solely for making arrows, 4 types of wood, which all required straightening procedures, and 6 other materials. In contrast, the Tasmanian technique of diving for crustaceans, which was exclusively women's work, probably requires both the development of substantial physical skill and lots of practice, but seems less likely to benefit from observing skilled models. Such risky diving techniques are not, to my knowledge, used by other cold climate foragers, and may have evolved in the absence of more complex food procurement technologies. So essentially, he's saying here, Tasmanians use diving as a way of meeting their dietary needs, because they did not have a sufficient population of skilled models to sustain a technology of missile manufacture. And there's so much else.
The gun room.
I mean, the gun room, right? They could not keep their gun room in shape. There's so much going on in this passage, but I thought at the time, now 13 years ago, this is just wrong. And then 3 years ago, when I was writing after the day after I wrote about this passage, I had to step away, and then I thought about it, and I said, well, but wait a minute, but there are other examples of cold water apnea divers. because as luck would have it, I had just seen just that week a notice for the new film Amasan by the Portuguese filmmaker Claudia Verjão, which is a documentary of a community of Amasan, of female breath hold divers in Japan. And not earlier that year, a paper had appeared in Current Biology, a prominent journal that attracted considerable attention, by Michel Ilardo and colleagues, documenting the changes in physiology, the heritable changes in physiology among the Bajau, a community of subsistence divers in eastern Indonesia. So I was already thinking, well, it's not so hard to find comparative cases. And so I did a little research. I mean, by research, I simply mean I went to the citation indices that weirdos like you and me use to find out about stuff. And it turns out that in 1966 or so, the US Navy had sponsored a big symposium on subsistence breath hold diving in Japan and Korea, right? Not hard to understand why the Navy would be interested in that. So there was a body of research on the physiology of this process, the ethnography of this process. And I realized that there was quite a bit that you could say using these comparative cases, even in the absence of reports from Tasmania from around 1800. There are some reports, but of course, no one was taking measures of vital capacity and the thermal insulative properties of fingertips and things like that. But even in the absence of that kind of information for Tasmania, there's a lot you could say about the skillfulness of breath hold diving in 10-degree water. And this seemed to get to the crux of the issue, which was that the way Henrik was formulated, and not just Henrik, but most practitioners at the time what's variously referred to as dual inheritance theory or cultural evolution, were formulating skill and its acquisition or its transfer from one generation to the next was just too brittle for my taste, and that, so this is where, so by brittle I just mean that it snaps, right? It's not supple enough to adapt. It's overfit to a very small pool of evidence, right? It takes certain cases that are salient to us for whatever reason, because they match our cultural templates for what a certain kind of life should be, or because they're easy to spot in the archaeological record, right? And uses those as a model for a much broader process of the reproduction of culture over time, right? Culture is not something that gets transmitted, but it's something that's reproduced, and that process of reproduction is itself highly indexical, right? The fact that we're participating in this process and our awareness of our participation in a process of remaking culture every time we go out, say to dive for abalone, is itself a key part of the process. So I wanted to bring some of these ideas from other areas of anthropology, the emphatic or indexical function of communication from linguistic anthropology, for instance, the dyadic sense making from the enactive or sensory motor school of embodied cognition, and I wanted to bring them into this conversation about what we're talking about when we say that culture evolves, or that culture is or is not a Darwinian process, and in that way kind of get to a more supple idea of what culture is. But at the time, I really didn't think I was talking about anything apart from a subsistence practice. But then a little more than a year ago, I realized that breathing in particular, and the way that the literature had deprecated breathing as opposed to, say, missile manufacture, was interesting for a number of reasons. I mean, some of them will probably be clear to the audience, but I don't have a sense of how people are reading this. What was your sense? What did you think of when you read this, I guess, a year ago now?
What did I think of when I read this?
Yeah.
Well, of course, right. There's the the currency, particularly then, right, a year ago, about breath and Blackness and an ability to live in contemporary society. And then, of course, as Chris mentioned in the introduction, COVID and lungs, and again, an ability to breathe, and certainly connected to Blackness. And as you're saying, measuring vital capacity, right? There's that wonderful book by Lindy Braun that traces the history of the spirometer and its connection to slavery and ideas about vital capacity and the ways in which those were already deeply racialized and continue to be built into that instrument, which is meant to objectively measure human vital capacity, and yet is, again, has literally built into it racist notions of human difference. And so part of what I think your work is also doing is pointing out, in this case, the problematic assumptions that are already shaping the idea, right? As you point out, the assumption that this work that women are doing, which is embodied and not, quote, technological, that it isn't as good or worth paying attention to. And you're saying, hey, wait a minute.
It's so, this is one of the things it's difficult to imagine a writer marking an activity by parenthetically reminding the reader that it was something that only men did, right? So already it's marked by virtue of the fact that it's women who do it, and again by the fact that that's something that we fixate on, right? Oh, women were gathering food too, right? Or actually, they were doing most of it, right? If you look at the ethnographic and historical record, say for Australia, about what was it that Richard Gould said? 90% of the time, 95% of the diet came from women. He was talking about a very different community in the Western Desert of Australia. So, but you see a similar phenomenon in a wide range of cases. We're shocked. We're always simply shocked to find that women were involved in the food gathering process. But somehow it's not as interesting, because they're not doing stuff that involves this extended operatory chain and externalizing their skill or projecting their skill into artifacts, right? Because artifacts, you have an easy to operationalize proxy for skill or technical complexity, which is count up the number of parts, or count up the number of junctions, or count up the number of steps in the operatory chain, in the process, say in the case of making an arrowhead, from quarrying the material and preparing the blanks and doing the fine finish work, the débitage. But if it's something like diving, you may recognize that it requires physical courage, that it requires conditioning, but you don't even know how to start operationalizing that. So it becomes invisible. You simply don't try, and that's part of it's easier not to try when, by virtue of being Black or women, or in particular both, right? The individuals in question are simply, it's not that you're actively saying they don't matter, but they simply don't meet the threshold of salience, right? There's a kind of there's an implicit invisibility. There's a structural invisibility to certain parts of a community, and that's something that I guess it's latent in the passage, but it really did not become clear to me, and almost certainly that's in part because I'm writing as a white man. That's the only thing I can do, right? I feel like it's important to fail with good intentions at projecting ourselves into the lives of other people, right? I know that's probably an unpopular view today, but it wasn't until last year until a couple of years after I wrote this, and in particular when during the demonstrations for the movement for Black Lives last summer, that I really began to understand how the racism, frankly, layered into the way we prioritize some activities as skillful, and other activities as stuff you do because you don't have skill. You have physical courage, and you can use that. You can sort of bash your way through, right? But that, and none of that is to say that the challenge does not remain. Well, how do you operationalize this? How would you formulate a more precise model of the change over time in a procedure like apnea diving, right? It's not as easy to say how you would do that, but that doesn't mean you don't have to try. You don't have to. This book is not an anti-model book. It's an anti-brittleness book. Yeah.
Well, and because part of your point, which I think, again, using the example of design, most designers are not trained to think about or understand, because the designers are trained to make a thing, make a product to solve a problem, which means technology, not entrainment. Right. So all problems must be solved via that strategy, which makes all other strategies irrelevant. So that's already, a problem. But also, oh no, where I got lost with myself.
This is good, because we need to talk about design. We need,
I mean, part of what design takes endless forms, and one of them is the design of the question you're asking. And so I think that's where one aspect of what you're doing goes, is ask the right question, or the question you design is going to produce certain answers. And if you redesign the question, you redesign the answer.
The history of the spirometer is an excellent case in point. But let's see. I've been remiss in not addressing your question about design from
and so when you say in this basic in this analysis, but also the provocation, why it, in a way, the way I interpret what you're saying is, why does this example of these women doing crustacean diving, why is that evidence of a kind of cultural devolution?
Right.
You're saying you're not accepting his claim.
Right.
And you're redesigning the question, in a sense, to say, hey, wait a minute.
I am redesigning, or less charitably pivoting the question. Yes. I am saying that's great. but there's if we can count up the number of parts in an arrow. I mean, there's no, all respect to the Yahan. I'm not Tierra del Fuego, right? I'm not disparaging other strategies that are mediated through
Right.
I'm saying that's great, and to be fair, Henrik is not. It was not Henrik who popularized that strategy of measuring skill. That comes from an earlier paper by the archaeologist Andrew Sherratt in 2001. So which I talk about in a previous chapter. But there's a reason that design is in the subtitle, right? I get asked about the title of this book all the time, and usually I have this extended story to tell about why it's the human scaffold and that. But then people say that's nice, but really I was more interested in the subtitle. Why is the subtitle? And I did want this book, or I do want this book, to speak to people doing design. Because design, I'm not. I guess since so much of my early training was in the sociology of knowledge, and we talk a lot about professional socialization and the formation of self-policing communities. And design is such a fascinating case, because design has kind of has sort of eaten the world over the past 20 years, right? And there's been this period in which in what used to be called industrial design or product design, right, stopped being about the design of Palm Pilots and tables and chairs, and started being about the design of emergency room workflows, right, and municipalities. And a lot of there's been no good contextual history of it. There are a lot of actors' histories, and in particular, I was struck years ago, before this book was a gleam in my eye. So in 2013, I gave a talk at IDEO's studio in Munich, and it turns out that so I was living in Munich at the time, and it turns out that Munich is really the big center for industrial design in Germany, not Berlin or Hamburg, because Munich is where the auto industry was, and to a certain degree still is, right? Audi and BMW are there. So I was giving a talk at IDEO, and I was spending a lot of time in the design community when I lived in Munich. And after I gave this talk, part of the swag that they gave me was a copy of IDEO former CEO Tim Brown's book "Change by Design," which is about how IDEO redesigned itself as a strategy organization in his time there. And so I was thinking about that too over the course of the time when this book was taking form, and I wanted to speak to this question, this fact, really, not a question, but the fact that design has become kind of a modal frame for thinking about challenging problems like the our carbon excess, our carbon debt, right? Our conversation, since you've been teaching at Art Center for a long time now, and in particular were instrumental in formulating this field-based MFA, right, in media arts and practice. It was really instrumental in that. I mean, I know you've spent a lot of time trying to get designers to spend more time in the field.
Yeah, and so I coming back to this example, I was thinking about the ways in which anthropologists, and it's particularly, say, in linguistics, when we think about categories, for instance, the way that initial example that you talk about creates this category of technology and enactment, right? And I talk to my students a fair amount, and I talk to myself a fair amount about, the world is what it is. And then we, as humans, create concepts, notions, et cetera, that help us negotiate, understand, interact with that world. And those can be very effective. But this, for instance, this divide, technology, entrainment, that's just something we made up, right?
Yeah. Right. Right. At one point after sort of using it over the first half of the book, I try to walk it back, right? So it's sort of at that point become more obstruction than help, right? Because at the end of the day, if you just had an artifact, right? If you just a panel of artifacts, a portmanteau, if you just had a toolkit of stuff, and you had no information about how any of it was used, well, J.J. Gibson talked about affordances, right? And this has become a very, very prominent concept in the design world. See, I almost said design space, which shows that I've been in this world a long. In the design world, the handle of a hammer, right? If you reaches out to have you grab it, right? It suggests how it's a natural way of using it, right? But and there may be something to that, but if you just had a toolkit sort of knolled out, on the floor in front of you, and that was all you had, if you had none of the motor engrams, none of the behavioral repertoire in which that toolkit is embedded, you would not really be able to do much with it, right? And that it's the way that it's not the material stuff. It's not the technical artifacts, the residues that are the vectors of cultural evolution. It's the way that we continue to enact behavior around them dyadically in relationships. It's this dyadic or collaborative sense-making process that's really what we should be thinking about, is what are we trying to design? What are we trying to change? And I feel like I've been thinking this way for so long that I feel a bit sheepish. I feel like I'm saying something obvious, but it seems like it's still not all that common. I go back to the architectural theorist Bill Hillier talks about cities this way. He says cities are not really the important. When we look at a city, what we think the city is the material residues, the buildings and the road networks. And okay, those are there, but those are part of it. But those are part of a city, the same way that the ephemeral gestures, right, the speech, the vocalizations and manual gestures that through which we enact language are part of language, right? Those are the material precipitates of it. But those are not the thing itself. The thing itself is the way they're configured into a stream of gestures over time. It's the configurational thing, as he puts it, that we should be thinking about when we ask what is a city. And I feel the same is true about looking at technology as it unfolds or as we design it, right? And you say that to people and they say, but that's so, but then it could be interrupted, right? It's so if it's not, if it's this thing that only exists by virtue of being lived socially at all times, then it's really fragile. And but somehow we've managed to keep language going for the better part now of 80, 100,000 years. So
at least some of them.
Yeah, some of them, right? and we've managed to keep the faculty for, the fact that we become in language over the course of our early years, right? Yes, it is fragile, but at the same time, it's remarkably robust. And I would like to see more designers think this way, because if we understood that the material stuff is not primary, it would expand our design space for imagining. I don't want to say ways out of a crisis, right? I've become a little cagey about the word crisis, because it who is it? Joseph Amasco said that it creates this foreshortening of horizons, right? If we're in a permanent crisis, it makes it impossible to imagine to imagine things unfolding over a longer time period, right? So it's not design our way out of a crisis, but if it would create a richer space of options for just thinking about how to live, I guess.
Absolutely. You could say. Absolutely. Well, and I think very much of what you're saying is connected to this, basic anthropological question of, fundamental humanness, which gets mixed up in design with ideas of universality that are hugely problematic. And the fundamental, so for instance, right, the fundamental capacity for language and the fundamental need to have language to be a full human, right? Because we know from those cases that that have been documented that young
Jeannie, the girl who
people, who grow up without language, don't cognitively and emotionally, it's not, after a certain point, it's not possible for them to really be fully cognitively or emotionally, normal or human. But that is part of that dyadic, dynamic, interactive. We need that. We require that.
Yes, and that's, see, everyone likes to talk now about things happening in the brain, right? Language is something that happens in the brain, X, Y, Z.
I mean, it does, but
but the critical periods in language development are largely critical periods in socialization, right? They're periods where
absolutely,
because when you're 3 years old and you make mistakes in every sentence, people smile and praise you, right? When you do that, when you're trying to learn a language later on, you don't receive the same kind of encouragement. Which is not to say there aren't physiological critical windows, but there's something more fundamental here that you're getting at when you talk about the dyadic nature of language and all social processes, all indexical processes, including like learning when an 11-year-old girl goes out with her aunts to learn how to dive, right? Which is so I've been thinking about this a lot lately because we have all spent so much time on these video calls, right, in the past year and a half. And someone said to me a couple of weeks back, you do something that I haven't seen many people do, which is you tend to look off screen. Well, for me, that shows that I'm actually listening, because I can't be looking something up while you're talking to me, right? If I'm looking off screen. But I said, it occurred to me right then, if you go to a lab where people are studying how language acquisition in young kids, like really young, say between 9 and 18 months, you can look around and see pretty quickly which babies are going to pick up sound system and forget about vocabulary, but just phonology faster. It's not the ones who are focused on the model, who are focused on the skilled model, who's ascending, who's establishing the link between a verbal gesture and stuff in the world. And it's not the ones who are focused on the object of ostension. It's the ones who are alternating their gaze back and forth. It's the ones who are establishing a triadic relationship between themselves, their interlocutor, and some other thing in the world, right? So which is why languages tend to have at least 3 degrees of deixis, right? You can refer to yourself, or you can refer to an addressee, or you can refer to this third thing. And in many languages, a difference is made overt in pronouns between that third thing and then some other thing which is not present, right? So you have the 4th degree. But yes, exactly. This is what I didn't do a very good job of drawing it out in the book, but this is exactly the kind of attention to that not the operatory chain, but the discourse chain, the moment when a speech register is negotiated in conversation. This is exactly this. I wanted to bring that kind of attention to other kinds of motor skills, right? So, not to say emotional skills, right? If you're conditioned starting from the time that you're a child, to swim in 10-degree water, and so what's that in Fahrenheit? So let's say 50-degree water, right? And so for one thing, 50-degree air doesn't feel too bad, but the thermal conductance of water is something like 20 times that of air, right? So 50-degree water, it's very cold, right? But if part of what you're being conditioned for, of course, is physiological tolerance, but part of it is just I hate to use the words because they've become so politicized, but I guess you could say something like grit, something like indifference to discomfort, right? And so you of course you pick that. That also is something that's being modeled in a relationship, and you're looking around and seeing, is everyone else screaming when they get in the water? No. Well, I guess this is just something you get used to, right? But it's doing that over and over again, right? That in itself is skillful. That's skillful behavior, the same way that learning to use projectiles is skillful, right?
Absolutely.
But we just don't see it as the same. And the more I've thought about it over the past year, the more I've come to realize what I did not realize what I guess I knew, but I could not have articulated it this way when I wrote the book, was that we don't see it that way, because we don't see the people who are doing that thing as being skillful, right?
Yes.
We don't see them as participants in skill.
And again, for me, this comes back to Black feminist thinkers like Sylvia Wynter, right? Who has this wonderful, she was attending a symposium at the Smithsonian on the 500 years since Christopher Columbus. And she gets up to give her talk, and all these people have been talking about we this, we that, and she gets up and she says, who is we?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Which is a bit of the elephant in the room, because when we invoke that as academics in the United States talking to a certain group, we're of and representing a very small slice of humanness. And so certainly in anthropology, we like to think that we think broadly about what that is, but when making theories about and claims for that, then, as you say, put a whole bunch of people to the side, there's that we is not doing the work that it ought to.
I have such a we problem, because I do this all the time.
It's not about you personally, though.
No,
right? This is our we-ness, where I'm just following your line of discussion about, again, breathing and entrainment and conditioning.
Yeah.
To think about, here I am in Fresno. It's going to be 105 degrees today, right? Everybody here has an air-conditioned home. But when was air conditioning invented?
Right.
When was Fresno settled?
Right.
Right? People lived here. Maybe they didn't love the heat, but people were very capable of living here for a very long time before air conditioning was invented. And they lived, they reproduced, and I'm pretty sure that they were entrained to tolerate ranges of cold and heat
Right.
without, the kinds of habits of body that I have in relation to cold and heat, which are, oh goodness, I can't,
this is see, this is such a problem because you can't simply say now, okay, well, everyone should just chuck out their air conditioners because it's you pull one thread and the whole tapestry unravels, right? Like now air conditioning has allowed us to design structures in a completely obtuse fashion because they're not articulated, they're not entrained to the climate.
Absolutely. Right? When you have a 3,000 square foot McMansion in Texas, you're not in training to that, right? Physical atmosphere, and it does require, right, entrainment really from infancy to tolerate the heat, to tolerate the cold, but also to have the people around you who are, and it's not necessarily just suffering, because again, the small amount of work I've done in that area, there's a wonderful I don't remember, there's a wonderful letter written from a Native American leader to the federal government, and in the maybe the 1700s, and the federal government of the United States has very graciously offered, to educate the fine young men of the tribe, and right, for them to go to these colleges. And the letter says, well, yes, we tried that, and you took our boys, and they came back and they couldn't do anything. They couldn't run in the cold. They couldn't, they couldn't hunt. They couldn't do all these things that they need to do. So what we suggest is that you send us some of your fine men, and we will train them how to do these very important things. And so it's not about, they don't feel the cold because they're primitive.
No.
It's about developing habits of body and mind,
right,
that allow you to do what you need to do. It's
skillful, and yet it's not amenable to commodification in the same way. You can't market it. You can't, right? I was about 6 weeks back, Branko Milanovic, the economist who writes about the relationship between growth and inequality, published in his newsletter I don't want to say screed, but a firm critique of degrowth and steady state economics. And he makes various useful points, such as it's very difficult to reduce inequality without growth, because then you're asking people to give up stuff that they may have by virtue of accidents of life history, but they consider theirs, right? And so growing the pie is less conflict prone than asking people to share. But then, but then he says at the end, but really the problem, if you really want to show that growth is incidental to economic life, you need to start by removing insatiable need from our system of economic arrangements. And I just can't see how you could do that, how you could create, I can't see any foreseeable future in which that. So this is not a problem of physics or even of politics. This is a problem of vision, right?
Absolutely.
We have become maybe simply we're unable, let's say, we are unable to imagine a system of economic arrangements that does not entail an insatiable drive to get new stuff, right?
And constant economic growth at the rate of 3% a year,
right,
in perpetuity.
Right. So,
which is why we need to industrialize space.
Oh, we should. Oh, I so wish we could have. I did this all wrong. We should have reserved like half the time for a laboratory of speculative ethnology demonstration.
No, but it does lead there, right? I mean, in that vision, it's quite clear, right? There's a reason that Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson are just trying to design their way out. And
I mean, but the amazing thing is they're basically following a blueprint that Octavia Butler laid down.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? Absolutely. I mean, there's always a Black woman who was there first, right? And was denied the opportunity to see it through. I don't know. I think Chris is probably going to say this is probably where we're going.
We're just getting warmed up.
I know. Can we have a second hour?
No. But it's and I think one of the things that I love about design is that energy for intervention, right? That capacity and ability to get out there and do something. And in anthropology, we're very good about talking about the problem forever.
We do a lot of negative dialectics. Yeah,
we're really good at it. And what I would love to see, right, is a combination of those things that brings that interventionist energy together with this sort of wide-ranging and subtle, nuanced kind of thinking that you bring to the table, in the sense of, we've talked economics, evolution, linguistics, biology, environment. What else? I don't know. Are there other right? And
air conditioning.
Air conditioning. But understanding that all of that it's very complex and dynamic, and it's not sort of Lego pieces that you move around.
Yeah, right. It's it's not even like hafting an arrowhead, right? The pieces come to exist by virtue of the relationships between.
Absolutely.
They don't. It's not like they exist aforethought and then you can manipulate them in different ways, right?
And so I think that enormous scope that the book covers, which is it's in some ways it's small in page numbers, but the ideas are really extraordinarily broad in the sense of time scope and the range of literatures and fields that you're bringing together to do this thinking. But it's so crucial because you're making this point that, again, the human are the environment, that these are mutual construction system. System's not quite the right word because of all that implies, but the relationalness is at so many levels, and it's co-constructed.
I know we're probably just out of time, but what you said, since we started before the hour, we were talking about dreams. Who has dreams? Who does not have dreams? Right? What do we dream about? And around the time that I was revising this book, so a little less than 2 years ago, I had a dream that I'm still struggling with. And it was a very simple dream, which is I was standing in front of a wall and watching essentially a projection on the wall from somewhere behind me. And the projection was supposed to be of like a scatter plot of atmospheric pressure readings or something. It didn't make much sense. It was a dream. It didn't have to. It was a dream. But bit by bit, the scatter plot began to rearrange itself, or to take form in the shape of a head of a large deer, like a stag. And then it began to move back and forth, kind of sensing the environment. And I just stood there. And that was the whole dream, right? But I've been thinking about it ever since, because I woke up and I knew exactly what it was referring to. Because there's this problem in the philosophy of biology, which about the evolution of cooperative behavior, right? Because you have a space with two Nash equilibria, right? One where everyone defects, everyone does their own thing, and the other where you have a quorum of people, a sufficient proportion of people cooperate to do the big thing that will benefit everyone more, right? But there's no ladder from one to the other. So how does cooperation take form in the wild? And I didn't get as far into it as I would have liked in the book, but I'm still thinking about this, because I feel that the way the problem has been set up in the philosophy of biology, even by some very subtle thinkers such as Brian Skirms, is all wrong, because it kind of takes for granted the idea that the agents in this game exist, and then you put them down in an environment. And the reason the stag is significant is because there's a version of this game attributed to Rousseau, in which a party of hunters is out in a wood, and they have the choice either to hunt hare or to hunt stag. They can only hunt the stag if everyone cooperates, right? But if you don't know if everyone else is going to cooperate, you're better off going off by yourself and hunting hare, right? You'll at least get something. Whereas if you try to hunt the stag and everyone else defects, if no one else cooperates, then you're screwed. So but these conjectural models always rely on the idea that the agents in this multiplayer game exist, and then you're plunking them down in an environment, right, and seeing what strategies they adopt. But of course, the environment was made through the same process that the agents with their subsistence toolkit came into being, and that's I guess that's the main thing I wanted to communicate. And as you said, that even niche construction doesn't even go far enough, right? Because it's more like we're being constructed through the process by which we learn to cope.
Okay. Zoom haphazards. My apologies. I I was stepping in to stop you just because we are a little bit over time now, but a fascinating discussion. I wish it could continue. I wish I could invite you both to lunch now. But for now, I just want to thank Elizabeth Chin and Josh Berson for sharing their insights and their dialogue. And Josh in particular for having written a really deeply insightful book, as Elizabeth says, extraordinarily broad and necessary. Again, it's The Human Scaffold, and it's available now from UC Press. I strongly recommend it. Just as a note for the audience, the next event in the Human Scaffold series will take place the morning of August 26th, and will feature author and entrepreneur Vaughn Tan in discussion with Josh about the kinds of mind games humans play with stuff. So mark your calendars for that. And in the meantime, thanks once more to Elizabeth and Josh for their time, and thanks so much to the audience for listening and watching.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.